and welcome. Um, let's see. Okay, so we're talking about splitting agile stories today. I accidentally made the mistake of going into last week's link. Hopefully I didn't cause anybody confusion with
Hello.
that. Can you hear me? You hear me
Yes, we
okay?
can hear you.
Okay.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. So early this morning I couldn't sleep. I woke up and I thought, I wonder what would happen if AI tried to draw a picture of somebody splitting user stories. And this is somebody splitting user stories by AI engine, which I thought was an interesting idea. It looks kind of a little bit violent for the books, but that's a that's artificial intelligence idea of splitting user stories. Okay, so we're going to and here, so along the same lines, can anyone guess what this is? So if that past one was
Burn down chart.
what?
A burn down chart.
Burn down chart could be the that's not a bad guess. This was in response to wanting a picture of mob programming. Yes, mob programming. That's that's what it was. Anyway, so I'm having some fun with this. Okay, and which we've got I think we've got the date nailed down. Austin Chadwick's going to be coming talk to us about mob programming here in a month or two. So that's gonna be exciting. Okay, Slido, go to that link if you don't have it. Should pop up, but you can also type in that number because we'll be using that as we go today. And here is a question for you. Here, I'm going to mute everybody just to make sure nothing happens that people don't expect, because sometimes that can be embarrassing. There we go. Okay, so why might you want to split a user story into two smaller stories? That should pop up for you in the, let's see. Okay, why is this not? Start presentation to display the joining instructions on this slide. Okay, for some reason something's not showing quite right. So let me try. Maybe I need to kick it off. It led me to believe it was working this morning. Okay, maybe I gotta do it this way. How have I done this? Okay, evidently it's been a while since I did one of these with Google Slides. Sorry about that. This gives us what we need. Okay, so I think now maybe if I do this, the slideshow. Okay, we just got all kinds of technology challenges. If I do this. Okay, well, we may have to jump back and forth. That's interesting. Okay, so go ahead and, is that showing up for you? Are you able to see it? I see somebody's typing.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yes, I can see.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so why might you want to split a user story into two smaller stories? And while you're typing that out, I'm going to see if I can get this to do what it's done for me in the past, which is show up in here. I may just have to jump back and forth. Okay, so the work fits into a sprint. That's a popular reason why. Story is too large, complete within a sprint, faster feedback, create a value increment within one sprint, finish the work in smaller chunks to finish the sprint. Okay, simplify a complex process into smaller components, reduce. So these are all answers. And we're going to talk about, I think some of these answers may be better than others, but these are all reasons that people try to split stories. And so I don't think we'll necessarily say that any of them are necessarily wrong, but I think some of them there may be some reasons that are better for splitting stories than others. Get a slice of functionality. The story is larger than the smallest amount of deliverable value. That's a good point. Discover unknowns while working on a story. Okay, so these are all great. So next question for you is, who is most in favor of splitting user stories on your team? So answer that while I see if I can find a way to get this to kick off for us here. this maybe. Okay, that's looking more like what we want. Nope, it's just not going to link up for us. Okay, well, we'll have to just jump back and forth. Okay, Scrum Masters, developers, business, quality assurance, management. It's interesting that most of them are Scrum Masters, or that's been most of our experience here. So let's go on here. Let's take a look and see. So let's talk about why we might want to split stories. So one reason that I think you will come up a lot is to fit in with us in a sprint. So the idea being, if we want this to fit within a sprint, so we're going to split the story down to fit within the sprint. And while that may be a good thing to try to get things to fit in the sprint, I think that may overlook a lot of value, because then if we think it's going to fit in the sprint, we may not split it, even if that might be a good idea to do. So that's a common reason for doing it. But I would suggest that the reason we want to split a story is so we can deliver something before we deliver everything. And in some ways, this might be driven a little bit by trying to fit it within a sprint, but this is a little bit different nuance, trying to deliver something before we deliver everything. So if we go to our Agile principle that says our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous software delivery, early and continuous delivery of valuable software, that implies that we need to be trying to find ways to deliver things more frequently. And maybe we want to make sure that we're not even limited to just a sprint. Maybe we ought to be aiming toward being able to deliver even more frequently than what fits into a sprint. Working software is the primary measure of progress. If we want to show progress, we need to be delivering software. That would tend to push us toward delivering more frequently, and the way to do that is to split things up into smaller units that are valuable. Delivering working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference toward this shorter time scale, that also suggests that we may want to split things up. Welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile processes harness change for a customer's competitive advantage. If we're able to deliver something small, get it into the customer's hand, and then get feedback on it, they may be able to change and adjust their requirements in ways that lets us be more efficient than if we give them something really, really big and then find out a lot of our assumptions were wrong. So here's a big story. So we've got a big story here, and we've got value is up and down and effort time are across. So this is a big story. What if we wanted to deliver half of the value in half the time? And I think this is what I want to walk you through here is when I started actually playing around with drawing this picture, it was a big aha moment for me, even though I'm very big into splitting stories and stuff, but it really made me visualize this in a way I hadn't before. Because if we start thinking here, okay, if we split the story like this and get rid of this half over here where the X is, we're now delivering all the value in half the time. Well, if we could do that, yeah, we should do that. But that's probably not going to be possible, right? If we want to deliver faster, we're probably going to need to deliver a smaller chunk of things. But if we go this way and split it this way and say, okay, we're going to deliver half the value in the same amount of time. Well, that's not what we want either, right? So splitting this, if we split this square in half, neither way that we can split this in half actually gives us what we want here. What we really want to do is this. We want to deliver half the value, which means halfway up and down, in half the time, which means halfway here. Well, we've actually ended up removing 3/4 of the area that this was covering. So we want to deliver that, right? Which means the next thing we will deliver, if we add in back the other half, now it's here. Now, what's interesting here is all that space that was green, we've now got half as much green as was green before. So what is all this area? And so throw it in the chat. What do you think this area represents? Like, why was that area filled in when we tried to do it all together? So what is it? Any thoughts? Unnecessary changes, it could be that. Assumptions, okay. Waste. So waste is good, but what type of waste? What is causing the waste there? The representation isn't accurate. That could be. I'm gonna suggest that it probably is reasonably accurate for what we're doing. Overdoing it, we'll talk about that in a minute. Delayed value to delivery. So that's the one that I was thinking of here. Extra stuff in case I can't ask you for more. that could be. Although that would probably expand the amount of effort that goes into it, right? In some cases, it's not real. The second half may take more time. Yes, that is true. This is an idealized way that we're splitting things up here. But keep in mind, even if these lines aren't perfect and we end up with chunks that aren't quite the same size, I think the principle behind what we're discussing is still going to hold true. So what was all that area? Oh, well, we just talked about it there. So I'm going to suggest that most of the time this is delay. And this delay right here is waiting for capacity, right? We're working on part of this story, which means we're working on the first part of the story, which means we don't have capacity to work on the second part of the story. So we're waiting till we have capacity to work on the next thing. Or maybe waiting because it's a dependency or something like that. And then this other area that we were able to remove is waiting to deploy it. Because once we've got that first part done, that first half of the story done, we're now, if we're dealing with this as a big chunk, we're now waiting before we're going to deploy it and get it into the customer's hands. So we have something that is presumably valuable to the customer that's done, but we're not deploying it yet because we're thinking of this as being the big block, the whole block of being the value that we're trying to deliver. So half of the story here is spent waiting, either waiting to have capacity to start on something or waiting to have time to deploy something. And I think if you look at your stories and start thinking in terms of if we deal with our story in the batch together the way it is, how much is it costing us in terms of waiting for capacity or waiting for deployment? And having those conversations, particularly with the customer, if you're able to get stuff to the customer quickly and the size of your story is preventing that from happening, is causing this delay of just waiting for deployment, it's a lot easier to really kind of drive the splitting of stories based on the fact that it will provide more value. But can we go any further, right? What if those stories can be split? What if each of those stories could be split into something small that's independently deliverable? And yes, this is extremely idealized. And you may not, there may be cases where you can't split a story into anything smaller. But even if you can't, look how much waste we've actually removed here. If we're able to do this even on just a small percentage of the story, it's worth the exercise of trying to split the story into something where we can actually do this on the ones where it might be possible. So 75% of this story is actually spent waiting because we're either waiting for capacity to start on the next part or we're waiting to deploy it after the piece is done. So this was kind of, when I started sketching this out, this was kind of my expression that went through my head when I was seeing this, because I hadn't ever really recognized. I knew it was important, and for years I'd been encouraging people to do it, like get value to the customer sooner, but I hadn't really ever sketched it out and thought, just how valuable is this? So what is splitting the story lets us find parts that we can skip, right? If we deal with this all as one big thing, we will probably try to do all of it. If I start splitting it up, I may find as I'm delivering stuff to the customer, it's very likely that they're going to come back at some point and say, hey, you know, that one thing we thought we needed, now that we've got these other things, that last piece you're going to give us really isn't as important as this. We've gotten the things that have the most value to us here. This thing, we may want it sometime, but let's do something else that's higher value than that piece we were able to split off. Because if we start splitting things down, we can now sort them according to how valuable they are to the customer. But we can't make those decisions when you've got them all together. If it's all together and we're seeing it as one monolithic story that we have to deliver, we're not going to give ourselves the opportunity to deprioritize parts of it if it turns out in the course of things that the customer may say, hey, you know what? That's important, but not as important as something else. So that brings us back to our principle of saying simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. Okay, so how often have you found a way to lower scope by splitting a story? So is this something that you guys are experiencing where you're able to lower the score? Oh, okay, well that works from here. Okay, now I see what I need to do. Let me get through this. Okay. Are these different than what I did? Okay, hang on, let me get caught up to where we are. Just having all kinds of technical excitement today. Okay, I think that will let you fill it out. Is that working for you guys? Okay, great. How often have you found a way to lower scope by splitting a story? So over here would be, I guess I didn't really label my scale, but very, very often, you know, it's a 5 on a scale of 1 to 5, or very unoften, or maybe about half the time. About half the time you're finding about in the middle. sometimes you can't, often you can't find a way to lower scope, but just as often you can find a way to lower scope. So this is a, that's a graph that probably somewhat represents what we would expect here. And this chart I want to show you here is, I know I've mentioned cases where I've worked with a small team of developers, like 5 developers, that was able to out-deliver what had been estimated to require 50 developers. This is why that can happen. Because if you have a small group that's really delivered by customer value, delivering small increments all the way through, communicating with the customer, finding things that can be left out or deprioritized in order to give the customer what they need, that's how you can get to the points where you can have something where it looked like it was going to take 10 times as much effort and it only takes a tenth of it. So, why split stories? To fit within a sprint. I'm going to suggest that's probably not the best reason to split stories. If the only reason you're splitting a story is to fit it within the sprint, you're probably not going to take advantage of all the opportunities that splitting stories will give you. We want to deliver something before we deliver everything. Because if we get so focused on trying to deliver everything, it's going to take a long time. We're going to have all that waste in there. All that waste that we were able to cut out is a symptom of trying to deliver everything instead of focusing on trying to deliver something first. And then you have to have discussions about what's that something that the customer actually wants. If I deliver it as a monolithic big block, I don't have to have the conversations. I'm not going to be forcing those conversations that the customer is saying, yeah, that's not really valuable, but this other part is, because we're presenting it as if, nope, this just all has to be done together. The other piece of this is this often fills with unnecessary work. I have been on projects that had lots and lots of people, and the logic behind it was, we're going to have people work on all these parts at the same time. And sometimes that can be done. On some of the projects I've been on, though, what ends up happening is all that time of waiting just fills with work that's not actually producing anything for the customer. And that's in the best situation. In some of the situations, all of that area right there fills with unnecessary work that actually slows down the delivery of everything, because people are trying to create frameworks for stuff and trying to really think about the problem and find ways to solve it, find ways to build things that they think they're going to need in the future without it being driven by something the customer is actually asking for, which sometimes has some benefit, but most of the time actually slows things down instead of speeding it up. And then this is, like we mentioned, that's the place where you're waiting to actually get the value into the customer's hands. Excuse me. So the other advantage of doing this is we can now reorder when things are delivered. So we can say, okay, the customer can say, hey, yes, we want all this stuff. We split it down to smaller pieces. I actually want that thing we were going to do third. I want that first because I need to show it to investors. Because we think it's risky and we need to actually try it first. Or this is something that was going to be really important to one of the developer's customers. And so if we can get that out sooner, it's going to be a good thing for retaining customers and stuff. So if we split it up, we're able to reorder those things. If it's all together, we don't give ourselves that option. And then we got the return on investment, right? If we finish that piece and then deliver it, that first piece there, we are now getting value. The customer is getting value from that while we work on the next piece. And then we deliver that. And they get value from that as we work on it. And then next piece, and they get value from it. And this is a very... For a lot of people, this does not come naturally because they want to deliver the whole thing. If you are around startups a lot, you will see this comes very, very naturally because usually, unless they've got unlimited funding, they need to get something into their customers' hands that people are willing to pay for without waiting till the very end. If they deliver the entire thing of everything they could possibly imagine that their customers would want and wait to deliver it them, they will probably run out of money and go out of business before they actually deliver everything. So doing this on a story by story level makes us more efficient and means our customers are going to get more value. So when was the last time you heard someone on the team say, we better do this now because we'll need it later to justify expanding the scope of a story? If you never heard this month, today, this week, So the 15% that have never heard this, I'm amazed. That's an interesting environment to be in, because I know as a developer, this is the type of thing that is very, very easy for me to start thinking. Because it's very easy to think, oh, I want to do these things, so let me build out all this stuff because we're going to need this later on. So I'm going to build out my entire database layer here with the idea that then we'll use it for all these other things. But we'll get the entire data model all figured out before we actually go on and start delivering something. And as a developer, that makes perfect sense to me. As someone who thinks in terms of how do I deliver value, it's a really, really bad idea though, because the chances are a lot of that's going to have to actually change as we get into it. The other thing is I'm not giving myself the ability to deliver small increments to the customer that's going to actually be valuable to them, that they can give me feedback on and maybe completely redirect what we're trying to do. Excuse me. Teams overestimate the value of avoiding future changes. So one of the reasons that we wanted to let's do all this stuff because we're going to need it is the idea that if I build just what I need for today, I'm going to have to come back later and then expand it and evolve it to do other things. We're going to have to, we have this idea that if I build this one piece that does something really simple and I build just what I need to be able to make it work to get it to the customer, I'm going to have to come in later and kind of hook into that. So if you think of, I'm thinking of, I was talking to somebody about church construction the other day, and one of the things I've seen a lot of large buildings, organizations that need a large auditorium where it may grow, and like churches, often what they'll do is build part of a building that can house a large auditorium with the idea that you can eventually take down this wall and mirror it and make it twice as big. That's a way to kind of protect against needing to be, if you need to build bigger in the future. But that's much, much more efficient to go ahead and do that than say, oh, we're just going to build this to be 3 times what we need or twice as big as what we need just in case we happen to grow. No, and they're fine with taking down the wall because it gives them the option to have it in the future without necessarily having to fully commit to it today. So teams overestimate the value of avoiding future changes and often build lots of things with the idea of, I build this today, I won't have to change it later. But in doing so, they actually create the thing they're trying to avoid, though, because they build a bunch of stuff without the feedback from the customer without the customer actually giving all the feedback, where the customer may change their mind or deprioritize some pieces of it, or say something's very, very different than what it appeared to be when the customer was originally talking. We'll look at some examples of that here in a minute. Teams underestimate the value of getting something into the customer's hands where they can actually get feedback. Getting something that does something functional for the customer, however small it is really, really valuable in terms of making the project successful. Because that's the first time what the customer asks for and what they actually want often are not exactly aligned. And that's not a bad thing. It's not their fault. It's just because when you start actually seeing something, you realize what you need in ways that you won't when you're just envisioning it in your head. I see the thing related to this. I hear, while we have the hood open. And I like that you brought that up, because this is something that if it is difficult to make changes to our software, then we will try to lump our stories together instead of making them smaller. And the problem there isn't that the stories need to be bigger. The problem is we need to build the ability to change and evolve into the process of creating software. So that means we probably want test, we probably want continuous integration. We want all those things to be really, really smooth, because that helps drive our ability to deliver very small chunks. So teams dramatically underestimate the value of getting something into the customer's hands and dramatically overestimate the value of not having to touch code a second time. Okay, so have you guys heard this? You've heard the team say this or never heard this one before? If we don't do this now, we'll never get around to it. And one thing, I've had this conversation with some teams and they say, if we don't do this now, we'll never get around to this. And one of the conversations I've had with people is said, okay, so you're telling me that in terms of prioritization, if we don't do this today, it will never become the next most important thing that we could be working on. And the individual I was talking to was like, yes, that's right. So we'll never do it. I said, that sounds like a feature, not a bug, right? You just told me that this isn't important enough for us to work on unless we slide it in with some other work that we're doing. Well, if that's the case, then we probably shouldn't do it. We've just identified that this thing is low enough priority that we shouldn't work on it. And what you're saying is you don't foresee that it will ever be high enough priority that we'll choose to work on it. Anyway, those are interesting conversations to have. So let's look at how to split up stories. So, advertisements in the middle. This is starting on February 19th. This is the paid class I'm doing through maven.com, where we're going to be going through these books and looking at the agile principles that show up in these non-agile books. So these are books about just popular business books, have lots of great information, great strategies and things in them, but we're going to be mining the summaries of these for agile principles and then talking through how those apply in different situations. So I'm very excited about doing this, going through this with the people that are there. If you are interested, shoot me an email. I think I've still got a key code for a discount for the Agile Lunch and Learn group. It's not going to be a huge group. I think we'll probably end up somewhere between 5 and 10 people because I wanted a small group to start it with, but we've got room for a few more if you're interested. Okay, back to our regular programming. Oh, skip that one. That one should have been there. Oops. Thought I'd take those out. Okay, how to split stories. So if we ask ourselves, what is the smallest thing that the customer would perceive as being valuable? The smallest thing we can give the customer that they would say, hey, I can do something now that I couldn't do before. We've made progress. This is evolving in a way that I'm able to do something with it that I want to be able to do. Well, here's a list of some things. Setting up a database is probably not going to be perceived. Did I mark these up? Okay, no. Okay, setting up a database, coding the back end, creating a framework. Those are all things that the customer is not going to see as being valuable. Now, it doesn't mean we're not going to do them. We are eventually going to have to set up a database. We're going to have to write code for the back end. We're going to have, we may have to create a framework, although that's always kind of a red flag. Say, wait, why are we really doing this? But the simplest thing we can usually start with is telling the customer, okay, what's the name of the application we're building for you? If you're building a web app, say, okay, we're going to put that name in the title and deploy this application all the way through. And we want you to go to the URL and see that the title is there. Now that sounds really, really small. And people will say, why would I even do that? That's so small. I can do it right. I can do it in 10 minutes. And you may be able to actually write the code for it in 10 minutes, but you have to get your environment set up. You've got to write the code for it. You've got to find a way to get it checked into your version control. You've then got to figure out how to get it deployed. You've got to make sure the customer actually has access to it. I mean, there's a lot of that last thing right there can take a very, very long time to do. But it's built around what the customer will see as being value and what the customer will see as being progress. So that's usually, if I'm working with a team that's doing a new web app, that's the first thing we do is say, okay, can we get the title? Can we create the title, figure out what the title is for this, talk to the customer and find out what they want the title to say on the main page, and let's see if we can deploy that. And let's also see if we can write a test to prove that the title shows up on that page. And it gets us started to where we're very focused on exactly what the customer will see as being progress and exactly being able to prove that the system does what the customer is asking for it to do through the tests. So if we think of our software as a cake here, there's 2 ways to slice it, right? If developers, this might make a funny video sometimes, but if you give a developer a cake, they're going to start thinking in terms of the way the cake is built, right? They're going to think in terms of there's a lower layer. So if you ever see somebody cut off the top of a cake, instead of slicing it down the middle and they cut off the top of it, it's probably a developer, right? Because they're going to be thinking, okay, at the bottom, we've got our database, and then we've got our business logic layer, and then we've got our UI, which maybe is the candles up top. But that's not how we want to that's not how the customer is thinking about the application. They're thinking of it as a slice all the way through. Sure, they know there's a database somewhere down by the bottom, and there's business logic and stuff, but they think of, oh, this is the piece of the application that lets me enter the fact that I made a check, that I wrote a check if it's an accounting application. Or this is the piece of the application that lets me add a contact to my email list. They're thinking in terms of what they can actually do. So the more we can align our development work and our stories with the way that the customer thinks about the application, the easier it is to actually deliver things in units that have meaning and value to the customer. We want to avoid this, and focus on being able to cut slices all the way through that touch everything, which means we don't need to build out the whole database layer. When we get to a story that requires a database, build just what's needed, build what's necessary to make it deploy itself, get that in the customer's hand, and then move on to the next thing, which will probably be another slice that happens to touch the database and all the layers. So here's some examples of splitting stories. This was a customer portal for a big print shop, actually here in town where I live, and we had been setting it up so their customers could come in and order all these print things online and different options and stuff, and it tied in and fed into their ERP system. But then they discovered that after we had done this and we delivered a bunch of stories, said, hey, you know what? Sometimes our customers need to actually, they submit something and then they realize they need to change it. Okay, so customers need to be able to modify orders. That sounds reasonable. And so they said, here's what we needed to do. Customers need to be able to change the orders. Administrators need to get the change notifications, and then administrators need to approve those changes. So how do you think the customer prioritized these options? So those were the three things they needed to do. And we said, okay, we can do all of this, but which piece of these things do you want first? What do you want first for your system? So in this case, what they wanted first, because the idea was the customer changed the order, that would send a notification to the admin, and then the admin would approve it. So the thing they wanted first was the customer can change the orders. And one of the reasons they wanted that first is because that is actually, that's the only one that's independent of the other two. And if the customers could change the orders, they'd have to pay close attention to see if anything changed or have the customer notify them. But they didn't actually have to. They could make the system work and start getting value from it by having the customer's ability to change the orders even before they built the rest of it. So let's graph this out here, or put it up on some imagery. So the thing was, they said they need to change the orders and associated workflows, and maybe they said that has medium value. That's valuable to us. It's not a super high value thing, but it's not low value. It's something we definitely need. Sorry, those colors may be hard to see. So then we split it up and we said notify admin of change, admin approval workflow, and let the user change order. And they said, okay, this piece, letting the user change the order, is the highest value thing. Let's build that first. So we built that and they started using it. And as they started using it, they had some different ideas of how they wanted the admin to actually be able to approve it and how they wanted the notification. So even though I was thinking once they get to this, the next most valuable thing would be sending the admin a notification of the change, I believe what they did is they said, no, that's not the most valuable thing. The next most valuable thing to us is letting the admin go in and approve it. Don't send the notification. They can just go in and check the list every day and see what's going on. But that's fine because that's more valuable than getting the notification of the admin change, which was unique for their particular situation. But if we didn't break this stuff up, we would have delivered the whole thing monolithically, which meant we would have waited a long time till they were able to actually start getting value from it. Okay, so here's another thing. Now, this is how I want you to notice we did not break this up, okay? So need to change orders and associated workflow. What we did not do is say, okay, first we're going to have a story to research the database upgrade. And then we're going to have another story to research workflow tools. And then finally, we're going to do what the customer asks for, which is change orders and associated workflows. And oftentimes, when people start talking about splitting stories, this is what they're actually doing. They're splitting it up to say, okay, I'm going to spend time thinking and researching stuff. And then I'm going to spend time doing these back end things. And then finally, I'm going to get to the story that actually is what the customer is asking for. And this is a really bad anti-pattern because, well, for a couple reasons. But one of the big reasons is because it's not being driven by what the customer is asking for. And what happens is you end up in this research phase, and without it being constrained by here's exactly what the customer is asking for, and our goal is to deliver this. So if I need to research something, it's just what's necessary to deliver this story. The scope of those research stories tend to grow and grow and grow because people keep thinking, oh, well, we should check into this and we should check into this. You're far better off, on average, if you're doing this story after story, to go ahead and get the simplest thing that would work through for the customer and then get customer feedback even if they come back and say, now we need it to do something very, very different. You build exactly what we asked for. We've tried it and we need these things changed. You are very unlikely to identify everything the customer is actually going to give you as feedback through just doing research in a silo. But you're very likely to do it if you get it into the customer's hands and let them actually try it. So once again, with that thing, we've got the customer getting return on investment because they were able to change the orders, and the next thing gave them return on investment, and they were able to start capturing some of that value sooner instead of waiting until all of it was done. How are we doing on time? Okay, I mentioned this one a few times, the intranet announcements. So this was a thing, they wanted announcements on an intranet site. We broke that up. They wanted to be able to schedule announcements, rotate announcements, and we broke it out to say, what about just showing a single announcement? And they said that would be the most valuable thing. And we said, well, that we can do in a day or two. This other stuff might take a few weeks. So we gave them the highest value part of it. And then these other things, they said, you know what? If we can take these other stories we've got, those become a lot lower value. See if you can split this other story, and let's see if we can get it that wasn't related to this at all. Let's get the most valuable piece of that out. As far as I know, or at least when I was working on this team, they never did come back to schedule the announcements and rotating the announcements, because there was always something else. If they could slice off something of another story, other things that they needed, they were always finding something that was higher value than coming back to these, which is exactly what we should be doing. So did we just find a pattern here? Well, when we need to do one or more things, we can start by building one thing instead of batching them all together. So, for example, I've used this before. A customer needs to be able to order shoes. Can we make it so they can order just one pair at a time? That might be a very good first step to some type of, if we're trying to do some type of e-commerce thing. So here we've got very simple. This shows why people don't hire me to design their e-commerce systems. We've got a bunch of shoes. You click on the order button. It takes you here. You type the size, name, address, credit card number, and you place the order. Okay, you can only order one pair of shoes at a time. But this means we don't have to have a shopping cart, a bunch of things like that. But this means that the customer that gets this can actually take this and start delivering it and start selling shoes online, which might be a very, very good thing for them. They may even need this if they're really short on cash. They may need to start selling shoes online before they're able to get to the next stage of being able to pay the developers to build out a shopping cart. I mean, granted, nowadays you just get off the shelf, but the idea is if you were needing to develop this custom. And to do that first thing, which might be very simple, but you're going to have to set up the web application, import the inventory, credit card processing, shipping processing, deal with hooking systems together, setting up Fire. I mean, there's a lot of stuff just to do that simple thing and get it through. But the difference is we're creating a bias for delivering something that's usable to the customer instead of a bias for trying to batch more things together. Let's see. Okay, so here's a simple thing. So this is ye old 401k, right? And we're building a system for 401k stuff. And you can assign what stock and what percentage you want to go to each stock. And let's say we're building this system. I would probably, if I was working with a team that was building this, I would probably encourage them to start with just saying, let's do it for one stock that gets 100%. And maybe we would never actually deploy that and put it in live production environment because we need the different percentages. But being able to deliver this to the customer and get feedback on how everything works together would be really, really valuable. We may find that this type of page, once they've got it and they use it, they may say, yeah, that doesn't work at all for us. But if we've got this page, we can talk and say, okay, now we're going to add multiple stocks and percentages. Is that the next most valuable thing? And they may say, yes, it is, but they may say, no, let's actually take what you've got now. We've got the basic flow. We understand how it will work if you add the percentages, but now let's go ahead and do security testing because it's a really big deal. So we've got enough of the flow to be able to start doing security testing on this. Let's start getting that feedback so it can help influence the rest of our development work. So when we need to do one or more things, start by building one of those things. What other patterns might exist? So can we do the story with simplified data? So here's an example. We're going to create a user here. And I've seen this is a pattern I see lots of times that tries to split a story. We need to create a user, get it into the system. Well, we've got name, address, account history, and there might be 20 other things we need about the user. But what if we get rid of these? The smallest set of data needed to create a user in the current system might just be the name, or it might just be the email address. So that would be one way. We could create a story that say create a user based on their name and email address, and that's it. That's something we can deliver, get into the customer's hands. They can start creating users and experiencing it, and then give us feedback as we build the rest of it. Can we defer validation? So we need validation, right? We want to make sure the name's valid and the account's address, the address is valid and the history, whatever was required for that. But we could wait on that in order to get something in the customer's hands earlier, even if that's not something we take all the way through to production. Or we could create validation that just does the server-side validation, which means you don't get feedback until you submit it. That might be perfectly acceptable to even deploy to production just to get the system working sooner. And then based on feedback, we can decide whether it makes sense to have client-side validation as part of it. For validation. So the question is can our customer provide feedback on what we've created without the validation? And usually the answer is probably going to be yes. What if the customer decides they don't need to create users? Now that may sound silly, but that type of thing happens, right? We can get into a situation where they're wanting to create users, and then once they see what the process is, they're like, hey, you know what? We don't want to do that. Let's have them log in with their Twitter, Facebook, or Google account. We're not actually going to create this process. It'll be easier to use something else or tie into another system. So we just realized we can pull all of our users from a different existing system or authenticate through that. Those are the types of things that happen. But if you're giving small units and getting feedback from it, you can take advantage of those and leverage them for the customer's competitive advantage. Simplifying the workflow. So this was funny. So I was playing around with some AI stuff and asking it to show me a really complicated factory line and a very simple factory line side by side. It turns out artificial intelligence is not very good at producing a complex picture side by side with a simple picture. But this was the best they could do, is the idea of you got a really complicated workflow and then a much simpler workflow next to it. But here's an example of workflow, right? We might have a workflow that says we get the user's info, we get the account info, we get optional info, more optional info, then we give them a summary, then we do a confirmation, and then eventually that shows up in the list. We can list the accounts and see that we created the user. We might be able to skip a lot of this, right? Just user account and then confirmation, and then they show up in the list of the accounts. Because all these other things, maybe the summary we can just skip, we want it someday, but we can actually get the system working before that. We may even be able to defer the confirmation. So instead of something like this, we just say, okay, you create the user, you hit submit, and it takes you back to the list of accounts, and you can see the user there. Now, that may not be what you want long term, but if you give that to the customer and let them say, okay, we did the simplest thing possible, this lets you create users, they can then start experiencing it. They may change their mind to how they want things done. They may even come back and say the next most important thing is to have a confirmation page or these other fields. But they also may say, that's great. Now that we can create customers, let's build now that we can create users in our system, let's create this other part that we figure is really, really high risk, but had to have some type of user object in place before we could build it. And so then they can address those things that are higher risk for them. And maybe they get into the high risk stuff and discover that the whole idea of the project is impossible and can't be done. That's good feedback to know. And even if that means the project gets canceled, giving them the ability to find that out sooner instead of after you've built out a bunch of user stuff that turns out they didn't need is a win. Can you defer one of the inputs or interfaces? So this is an example where this was a government system and they needed a UI to update the holiday schedule. And in their situation, they found out we were trying to find ways that we could simplify anything we possibly could. And they said, you know what? If we can get the calendar in a CSV file, we can just load it directly into the database, and then we're good for 12 months. So this isn't a high priority because we've got a way to deal with it for 12 months, and we eventually want it. But once we can push it off 12 months, there's a whole ton of other things that are more valuable to us. Can you process just part of an input? So here's another common pattern. You have a file with lots of data in it, and you need to start processing it. And what I usually encourage teams to do with this is say, can we just start with a header? Let's build the simplest thing that can check to see if it's a valid header, have tests to say it's either valid or it's invalid. And usually that's a lot of work to get all your system in place to start running files through, but it gives you a way that you can deliver things, start running files through it sooner rather than having to wait until you built everything. And then maybe next you add the summary total validation and you can build up from there. Okay, let's see. So I think, okay. Oh, yes, I wanted to show you this. So this is, let me see if I can find the link to this. This is from Agile for All, and they may have recently changed their name, but they've got some really good stuff on how to split user stories. And let me throw this in there's a PDF here. And it's basically just a chart that lets you look through it. Humanizing work. Okay. Anyway, this is a really useful thing to just look at. If you're having trouble splitting stories, just take a look at this and ask yourself these questions. It doesn't mean that every single time you're always going to be able to split a story, but most teams I've seen can get a lot of value out of just trying to split things a little bit more often than they do. So I download that PDF and hang on to it, keep the link or something, because I think it's a very valuable way to start getting conversations about how could we split this story up. Okay, quiz. Let's see, what are we going to do? We're going to give away copies of, do I have one here? Where's my book? We're going to give copies away of my productivity book. So it's not necessarily about starting or about Agile. This one's about how to be more productive. Everything from organizing your socks to strategies for parking as not losing as much time parking, to all kinds of things like that. So it's a series of just different articles on that I've got together in a nice little hardback book. So, and for this one, we're going to give 3 away. So the top 3 positions are going to get a copy of the book sent to them. Just make sure you email me if you're one of the winners. Okay, let's give it just a few more seconds. Looks like we've got 122 people on and 29 people. So is everybody able to join? Is that working? If you need to, you can go to slido.com. Got hand raised. So working okay? Okay. If it's not showing up inside of WebEx, you can go to slido.com and type in that number on your phone or in a web browser. Okay, we'll give it a few more seconds. Remember, we're giving away 3 copies of the book, so your chances are great of winning today. Just a few more seconds here. And you can still join afterwards, I think, but we're going to get started. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Okay. Which is the best reason, according to what I was saying, for trying to split stories? Best reason for trying to split stories. Is it to fit a story in a sprint, to deliver something before deliver everything, to humor Mark, to make it look like we are doing more work? And oftentimes teams I'm coaching, they start out just doing it to humor Mark. They're like, okay, this will make Mark be quiet if we go ahead and do this. So yes, deliver something before we deliver everything is probably the best reason for trying to split stories. Now, it has the added advantage of splitting within, of maybe making it easier to fit stuff within the sprint. But if we're driven by just trying to make it fit within the sprint, we're more likely to take on bigger stories than we need to and say, oh, it fits within a sprint, we're good. We don't need to split it anymore. Okay, there's our leaderboard. Got lots of people in top spot. Looks like Chris is in the very top. What is one way to split a story that needs to create multiple items? Create a generic way to create any number of items. That could be one way to split the story. Do an initial story that only allows a single item. Or wait until the end of the project to do this part. So yes, do initial story that only allows a single item is what we discussed here. Now, this create a generic way to create any number of items. The reason, here's the risk with that. If I know I need to do a bunch of things, all right, I need to be able to process a bunch of different types of things. And I start out by saying, I want to create a generic way that will work for processing all these things. I will probably make some decisions that are wrong. If I start out and say, I need to process a lot of these things, so I'm going to start off with the idea that my code is going to have to evolve, but I'm going to start off with just being able to process one thing and get it into the customer's hands and let them see how it looks and get feedback from them. I will probably make much, much better decisions if I've got the experience of doing one thing and then I go and try to figure out how to do other things. As a matter of fact, the pattern I see in a lot of cases is if I'm able to do one, get it working for the customer, and then I do another one along with it, and then look at how that code is similar and how it's different. The third one is the place that I'm probably in the best place to start thinking in terms of how to make it generic. If I try to start with that, I'm probably going to, this may be counterintuitive, but I will probably need to do a lot more rework as I try to add other files to it than I will if I go ahead and get 2 things working and then look for ways to make it more generic as I go. Now, depends on the exact situation and stuff, but that's a pattern I've seen in a lot of places, that if you're trying to make something that's more generic and more reusable, oftentimes the third time you have to use it is the place you're in the best position to take advantage of it. If you do it way later after that, you might not be taking advantage of. If you do it way after that, you may have done it more just individually than you need to. If you do it way before it, you probably don't actually have the experience to know what it needs to be successful. Okay, next question. If a story requires processing a file, you might try processing the complete file, starting by validating the header, create a generic file processing framework, or create file data integrity by monitoring the development. And I will tell you that last one was just a jumble of words that I don't know even what it means. So yes, the example we gave here was starting by validating the header. I guess it's a little bit of a trick question, because the idea would be to run the entire file through, but just ignore everything other than the header. But the idea is I can deliver the ability to validate the header before I validate everything else. So if I'm building a replacement system and there's files coming in every day to this system, once I get to the point that it's validating the header, I could in theory bring that up in parallel with the old system and start running files through to make sure my code's working and make sure it detects the same problems with the header that the old system the old system does. Okay, next question. Larger stories create happier customers, waste in waiting, faster feedback, or more return on investment. So if we choose to make larger stories, which one of these things is a byproduct of creating larger stories? Happier customers, waste in waiting, faster feedback, or more return on investment? And yes, waste in waiting. The larger stories are going to actually delay feedback. And the larger stories are actually going to mean that we delay how long it is before we're able to start earning a return on the investment. So larger stories actually create waste in waiting, because remember that chart, we're waiting to get to the point that we can start on something. And then once we finish a piece of it that could be valuable to the customer, we're waiting before we deploy it until we get to the end of the larger story. Okay, smaller stories do not, now this is tricky, do not let you. Which of these things do smaller stories not let you do? Get feedback sooner, reorder stories, minimize customer contact, or leave out parts that are lower value. Which one do smaller stories not let you do? And yes, so this was tricky the way it was worded, so sorry about that, particularly particularly if English isn't your primary language, this might have been really, really tricky. But so a smaller story will let you get feedback sooner. It will let you reorder stories. It will let you leave out parts that are lower value. But if you're working with smaller stories, you are going to have to maximize your customer contact, because you're delivering these stories in smaller pieces. So instead of waiting for one huge story to get done and then talking to the customer, you're going to be talking to the customer in much more frequent increments. So smaller stories will actually maximize your customer contact. Minimizing your customer contact is not something that smaller stories let you do. Okay, it looks like Chris got the top spot. So we've got Chris, LMF, and Daniel. So those are the 3 top spots. If you guys send me an email, I will get you a copy of my productivity book. I failed to bring one out here. It's in a box over there. But anyway, so send me an email. You can send a screenshot of this to say, yep, this was me. And I will get you a copy of that sent in the mail a little bit later this week. Okay, Chris says he already has it. So we'll do LMF, Daniel, and Ravi. So Ravi, if you guys, if the 3 of you, LMF, Daniel, and Ravi, if you don't have the book, let me know and we will get it head to you. Just give me oh, and thanks, Chris. I'm glad to hear you liked it. My email address, yes. So you can reply to any of the invites. But there is my email address. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes, and I think I've got Q&A. What's after this? Okay, cool. That was it. So we've got a few more minutes. One thing I want to let you know is that Maven class is coming up. If that sounds interesting to you, send me an email. I'll get you some details. And if it's something that you're interested in, I want to try to find a way to make it happen for you. Like I said, this is my first doing. We've done a lot of these, but this one's really focused on having a smaller group. and having a lot more discussion around it. That's interesting. Let me know. We'll try to find a way to make it happen for you. And also, if you want to see, I think I sent this out in the past, but if you want to see what one of the summaries look like, send me an email and I'll get you on the list that will give you more information and also get you one of the 5 dysfunction of teams. You can see that. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to stop the streaming here. And if anybody has any questions, suggestions, or aggravations, I would love to hear them.